Affirmative are not quite sure what gave tournament food poisoning. We think it's quite possibly Starbucks. In that situation, we would say it's probably a bad idea to buy that Starbucks. But more importantly, we think in cities like New York, when you, in order to get to that Starbucks store, you literally have to walk past homeless people sleeping on air vents in order to keep warm, and you prioritise you walking past those people in order to get yourself a coffee. We think that is absolutely morally wrong in this debate. We think you have a moral duty to instead alleviate suffering wherever possible, and that's what we stand by on side Affirmative. In terms of some kind of context to this debate, we'd just like to clarify a couple of things. Firstly, we think in order to alleviate suffering, this debate requires that to some extent what you do be successful. We think it requires some level of effective altruism in this debate. That means we think the duty is upon you to research to some extent and not just pour money into a bottomless well. We think that's something to recognise. But secondly, we think to the extent that you should be prioritising that doesn't mean that has to come at the cost of your abject suffering. We think it is still legitimate for you to prioritise things such as sending your children to getting them a good education in a situation where we still think that is absolutely an essential thing for your family. We don't think it has to come at the total cost of your happiness. In fact, we think this will make you far more happy in this debate. Two things to tell you. Firstly, why is there an absolute moral duty to alleviate suffering? And secondly, why is the marginal utility better for you? And other people, I should say. Firstly, why is there a moral duty to alleviate suffering? The first thing is that we recognise on side Affirmative that to all extents, or to some extent, sorry, the way that you accrue wealth is entirely dependent upon your birth. We think the lottery of life means that to some extent, whether you are born in Australia, whether you're born in America, whether you're born in Africa, absolutely determines your ability to accrue wealth. But importantly, even in a situation where that's not true, we think the narrative of you pulling yourself up by your bootstraps to take yourself from poverty in order to wealth is still determined by the situations you find yourself in. Whether that be because the conditions of society allowed you to do that in a way that it didn't allow someone else to do, or whether it be because certain skills you were given by extent or by circumstance of your genes means that was true, means that even in that situation it is still arbitrary to a large extent. But secondly, it is important to recognise that as unpalatable as it might be, at the point at which you accrue wealth, you are necessarily complicit in keeping other people poor. So this occurs A, on a political level, in the extent that you probably support things such as low taxation, or you probably have more political clout than those people. But secondly, even in a situation where you absolutely stand by the rights of poor people in that situation, it's important to recognise that resources are always finite. And therefore, to the extent that you are rich, it is necessary that someone else must be poor, because the market will always account for that. That means just by the very fact that you are rich means that someone else must be poor, which means you are complicit ultimately in their poverty. Thirdly, why is therefore the tax burden insufficient? Firstly, we would say it's because it's subject to the same political capital that we just talked about in terms of political capital being stronger for rich people. But secondly, we would say that even in a situation where that's not true, governments are objectively terrible at spending your dollars. So for instance, they often prioritise the working poor over the abject poor. So in terms of the way they support things like the minimum wage, they often prioritise certain types of poverty. Secondly, we would say that often preferences poverty over other forms of suffering. So we're going to talk a little bit in this debate about things such as domestic violence shelters, in the way that the government is structurally bad at dealing with those, because the political capital to deal with that form of suffering is far less than the political capital in order to deal with things such as poverty. But why are individuals therefore better in this debate? Why do we think they can do it? Firstly, because you think you inherently get a multiplicity of views. To the extent that everyone supports a different thing in a different form of alleviation of poverty, we think that means that you get a diversity in the way that aid is spread. So whether that be by giving aid, or by giving money to domestic violence shelters, or just by seeing someone who's poor in your street, which the government cannot do, we think everyone is going to do it in a different way. But secondly, that feeds into the notion that suffering is a subjective calculus. So what I view as alleviating suffering may be different to what someone else views as alleviating suffering. And to the extent that governments always have competing interests, they always have to put a lot of eggs in one basket in that situation, we think that is particularly problematic. But finally, we would say that people can always make a more empathetic connection with the people they're trying to help. We think that allows them to give to charities in a way that is more meaningful. We think that allows them to benefit those charities in a much more helpful way. Therefore, we think they're better at doing it. So we think people always have a duty to do it. But why does doing it actually lead to marginal utility, both for those people and for the people who are giving? Firstly, it's important to recognise that your happiness is no more or less inherently valuable than anybody else's. So to the extent that we on Side Affirmative can show that net happiness increases, we think we can win this debate. So why is that true? Firstly, we think materialism is absolutely a hoax. I'll deal with that more in a sec. But even to the extent that's not true, we would say that the person you're alleviating suffering for gains more net happiness from that than you do from having that luxury good. We think this occurs just because like someone who is poor is probably getting happier eating at all than you are in having your 7,000th yacht. But secondly, we would say that luxury goods are often overpriced in that situation. To the extent you could buy one luxury good, you could probably alleviate the suffering of multiple people. So even if it were true that that luxury good gave you the same happiness as some like nebulous thing of alleviating suffering for some other person, we would say you get a lot more of it by choosing to alleviate suffering. But thirdly, we would say, and importantly, those luxury goods are often short-term. And this feeds very nicely into why we think materialism is a hoax. We think you personally get more happiness. Why is that? Firstly, because we would say that materialism is extensively socially constructed. To the extent that you buy something which is gold and shiny, we think the only reason you gain happiness from that is because society tells you that it should make you more happy. And society expects of rich people that they should meet those kind of things. But importantly, materialism constructs the discourse around you so that you are never satisfied with what you have, which means you're always going to want to buy more in a particularly damaging way. What does that mean? Firstly, it means that you often don't get happier just from accruing that luxury good. Obviously that's true when you drink a very bad coffee from Starbucks. We also think it's true even if you buy a luxury car. Why is that? Because it often actually makes you less happy as an individual. Because A, you are taught that you never have enough. So even in a situation where you accrue those luxury goods, if someone else brings out another luxury good, you are inherently going to want to buy another one. What does that mean? It means you are never satisfied with what you have, so it is literally impossible for you ever to achieve true happiness in this debate. But secondly, we say you absolutely alienate yourself in a very harmful way, because to the extent that materialism is based on what you have, and it means that when you become very rich, you inherently build a narrative around you about what you have in comparison to other people. What that means is when you come across someone else who has something that you particularly want, you resent them for that, or vice versa, where they resent you if you have something they don't have. We think what that means is ultimately you're always going to alienate yourself from other people. And we would always prioritize someone who is poor with friends over someone who is rich without. So we think ultimately that is what is always going to give them happiness in the debate. Thirdly, we would say that happiness always comes through empathy and making somebody else happy. But finally, we would say that in the long run, this is also very beneficial for you, because what you are actually doing is creating yourself a safety net in this situation. One of the real reasons we think a lot of women would choose to give to domestic violence shelters is they are creating themselves a safety net as well. So in a situation where they later down the track are faced with the unfortunate reality that a lot of women are, it means that they too are in a position where they can benefit from that. We thought that was always going to give you more happiness in this debate, and that was something we were happy to stand by. We told you there was always a moral duty for you to help poor people. Most importantly, that gave them more happiness, that gave you more happiness. Given that was the only metric by which we could determine this debate, it had to go affirmative.
I'd like to thank the first speaker of the affirmative for his speech and invite James Rankin to open the case for Auckland 1.
Well, it was very touching when the first speaker bemoaned the fact that to get your Starbucks you have to walk past the homeless people on the street. Unfortunately, if you accept their arguments about reducing suffering and maximising utility, that homeless person would probably be collecting their coins and shipping those off to Africa. And the truth in this debate is that if you think it's fine to still send your child to a good school, but at the same time as saying that we have this absolute duty to people who are poorest, you can't have both of those in this debate. We think there are other factors like proximity, like your own individual choice, which are the most important considerations when you think about where your money should be spent. What do we stand for on this side of the house? We're happy to stand by a general system of taxation that is generally redistributive and that maximises happiness in that way. We also are happy to stand by, for instance, wealthy people donating their extra money to charities, which you see with like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, you see through people like Warren Buffett. We think that's a far superior mechanism to what they are proposing. I'm going to talk about two things in this speech. Firstly, why the duty they are proposing is an unreasonable burden to place on people. Secondly, I'm going to talk about outcomes, which they haven't really addressed so far in this debate. Firstly, I want to deal with some rebuttal. What the first speaker said is that rich people are firstly complicit in keeping other people poor because they do things such as support low levels of taxation. Firstly, just like we don't necessarily need to support rich people supporting low levels of taxation. Secondly, in what way is wealth a zero-sum game? Wealthy people innovate, they create new technologies which increase productivity and often increase wealth in the developing world when they export their companies to those other countries. It's not clear that they actually are keeping other people poor, so we reject that argument. Then he said that their policy is going to mean you get a division of charities donated to, and he mentioned the example of domestic violence. Firstly, it's not clear that you actually do get people donating to a whole host of charities because we think people do prioritise things that are proximate to them. So for instance, people are more likely to donate to the domestic violence shelter than to the people in Africa because they probably know people in their own community who have been affected by those issues. Importantly, it is not clear that people donating to domestic violence charities is a superior outcome or creates more happiness than if that money was spent in Africa. Because if they want to say that you do have an absolute duty, in the words of the first speaker, to maximise happiness, then you probably shouldn't donate to the domestic violence shelter, as crude as that sounds. Because people who are suffering from famine and who will otherwise die are probably going to have worse lives if you do that. The same applies for the ridiculous example of a yacht. Because the corollary of that is that if you spend any money in a way that isn't important for your survival, that money would be better spent elsewhere. So that means you, for instance, if you're in the Western world, you shouldn't have a 5-bedroom house, you shouldn't have a 3-bedroom house, you should cram the 5 people in your family into one room. Because so far as there are people in Africa or any other poor country who have it worse than you, that money should be spent there. We think that's an unreasonable burden to place on people in this debate. Finally, with respect to their arguments about materialism, we think materialism does make people happy to some extent, and to the extent that materialism doesn't make people happy, then you can choose to donate to charity if that makes you happier right now, right? It doesn't mean that you have an obligation to donate to charity. But secondly, they accepted themselves that happiness was subjective in this debate. So you can't say that, and then secondly stand up and say, objectively, materialism makes people unhappy, because they've conceded that materialism is subjective, so that argument doesn't work. It also doesn't follow from that point that abandoning materialism and adopting this strict moral duty makes people happier, so we think outside the house is the one that carries for happiness. The final point they said is that this ensures that there's a safety net for people if they fall into bad times. I've already explained why people aren't likely to donate to charities that do provide them a safety net, so you're more likely to donate to the domestic violence shelter, to other types of charities that don't actually provide safety nets for people if they do fall upon hard times. But secondly, taxation, which is a general redistributive measure, is a far superior way of ensuring that safety net, and I'm going to go on to prove why they reduce the amount of taxation in this debate. Firstly, why is this an unreasonable burden to place on people in this debate? And I firstly want to explain why there's actually no cogent distinction that they've tried to outline between essentials and desirables. Because if it is true that you have an absolute moral duty to maximise happiness or to reduce suffering, then what we would consider to be essentials in the developed world are actually luxuries in the developing world. So it was quite telling when the first speaker said, you can still choose to send your child to a good school, but at the point where you're spending tens of thousands of dollars to do that, that money should be spent elsewhere. That should be spent reducing famine in Africa. So they don't actually believe the policy or the obligation that they tried to set out. We think that that means that this is an unreasonable burden to place on people, and so far as they think that you should prioritise things like sending your child to a good school, they accept that there are other relevant moral factors that we should consider, like proximity to a family member, like proximity to other people in your community. Those are relevant factors which actually mitigate the moral duty which they set out. Second, we think people have their own subjective concepts of happiness, and people gain a large amount of happiness from having power over their own destiny. Importantly, there are two implications of this policy. The first one is that you don't ever get to choose to spend your money on items which are important to you. Because at the point where you can't spend on those things which are desirables, you effectively have no choice in where your money is going because you always have to donate it to charity. But importantly, you don't even have choice, if you accept their moral duty, in which charity you donate to. Because if you donate to a charity that isn't as effective in reducing suffering, then by their logic, you are committing a moral wrong. You are not fulfilling your moral obligation to the poor people that you are trying to help in this debate, because you could be donating that money to another charity. We think that also shows that this is an unreasonable moral burden to place on people. We think things like proximity also affect to whom we have obligations. Finally, we think this is also unfair because it imposes an unreasonable burden on people who have often worked hard to earn their money. So whilst we're all debaters and we all accept arguments like the lottery of birth and like the fact that you're only rich because you were born into rich societies, it is actually also true that there are people who have worked extremely hard to get where they are, that they have worked extremely hard to make more money than other people in their society. A consequence of the obligation they've set out is that if you have more money than others, even if it's by virtue of you working hard, you have a greater absolute obligation to help people who are worse than you than the people who have worked less hard than you, and that means that they have to donate less money to charity. It's not clear to us on this side of the house that people who have worked hard in that way, who have sacrificed hours, who have stayed up and worked late nights to create their own businesses, have a greater obligation than people who have worked less hard. Secondly, about outcomes, because part of the essential reason as to why people work hard in society, why they create societies, they create innovations, they create businesses, is because they know that they're going to see the fruits of their labour. They know that one day they'll be able to spend on those items which make them happy, like Starbucks for some people. At the point where everyone has a concrete moral obligation to give away all of that excess money to charity, people simply won't engage in that type of behaviour anymore. It's much less likely that people will create the types of businesses which do benefit societies, which means that you spread wealth around society when they employ people in their factories. We also think a consequence of this is that you reduce the general pool of taxation. And taxation is a good mechanism in this debate, because we think that the state is better at redistributing that money than individuals who don't have access to the type of information that the state does. And we think that the way this works is that you can send aid to countries like Africa. You can create businesses which then filter through to countries in Africa, like when Starbucks operates there. We think that's the second part of this point, that it's actually not true that charity is the most effective form of liberation for the developing world. So for instance, many of the Millennium Development Villages that have been established in various places of Africa have been seen by those communities to reduce the autonomy of those communities. Remember, this policy eviscerates companies like Starbucks. Those are companies that do operate in the developing world. So whilst they can also say that those companies have poor labour standards, the alternative for those people, often in many cases, is walking across rubbish dumps and picking up things to actually sell on for recycling. We think they destroy those companies, and those are much better at reducing suffering. This is entirely unreasonable. We're very proud of those.
I'd like to make the first speaker at the negative free speech and invite Molly Dale to continue the case for Monash.
Well, Mr. Speaker, it's a tragic reality of my existence that as a woman it is more likely than not that at some point in my life I will face the reality of being a victim of some form of assault or domestic violence against me. The fact that they wanted to say then that the tax burden was an effective way of discharging moral duties when governments, certainly Australia-wide, I don't know about necessarily the rest of the world, are shutting things like domestic violence and sexual assault resource centres down speaks to the endemic failure of those systems. But furthermore, what I'd say is that given I can acknowledge the reality of those statistics, it would be absolutely ludicrous for me to not, to some extent, seek to alleviate that suffering both from a selfless perspective and a selfish one in this debate. 3 questions integrating my rebuttal and substantive. Firstly, did an obligation to give exist? How did it manifest? Secondly, why we think it's in your long-run interest to do so, so that's going to be elaborating on what Sam brought you. And thirdly, why we think our model will be effective and lead to better forms of charity. So firstly, with regards to the obligation and how it manifested. Let's look at whether or not that obligation was fair to put on people. because they told us in response to what we said about your position of privilege being largely arbitrary and you being complicit, they told us a few things in response. The first was like, no, but we don't have to stand for political capture in this debate. We thought that insofar as that was a reality in literally every democratic system in the world, we thought that they probably did, right? We thought at the point that things like lobby groups exist and where the rich had disproportionate influence on the vote, to some extent they had to stand up for the fact that if you were wealthy, you had a greater sphere of political influence than those who were less fortunate than yourself. We thought that that meant that you were therefore more complicit in the decision-making process of that government, but also complicit in locking the poor out of the political process. Even if that weren't true in this debate, we told you that complicity worked in other ways. Because insofar as they were like, wealth is good and wealth creates jobs, what we'd tell you is that was fundamentally untrue at the rate of wealth disparity we saw in the world at the moment. Because what we told you was that like buying a luxury good like a yacht was not analogous to buying a factory that employed people and allowed them to alleviate themselves out of poverty. And that was never what this debate was about, right? It was your capacity to invest in business or things that would meaningfully lift poor people out of poverty, because that maybe alleviates suffering in some way. It was about your right to buy things like yachts or luxury cars or Starbucks in this debate. That did absolutely jack shit for poor people in this debate, Mr. Speaker, and for them to try and characterise otherwise was nonsense. Then they were like, but hard work exists and that somehow transcends the lottery of birth in this debate. What a furphy, right? Because we don't think that necessarily engaged with what we brought you about the ways in which your privilege could operate at so many levels. Because whilst we respected that you might have worked hard for that money, like a similar person who suffered a physical disability might just not be able to work hard in the same way that you did, regardless of how much they goddamn wanted to in the same world. So that's why we thought the obligation necessarily stood. Not just because your position of privilege was arbitrary, but because it meaningfully locked out others and contributed to their suffering. So secondly, how should the empathy play out in this debate? So firstly, let's look at this notion of us somehow therefore having to send all of our money to Africa all of the time. We told you at first that wasn't the case because we thought that in the same way suffering was reasonably subjective, we thought that that happiness was subjective, suffering was subjective. Because we weren't on our side of the house going to differentiate between the suffering of a homeless, starving person on the streets of New York City and a homeless, starving person in Africa, because we thought that both of those people were in trouble and both of those people warranted our help. In the same way, we wouldn't distinguish between the suffering of someone who's mentally ill and denied access to healthcare and the plight of trans kids all of the world around who are bullied and locked out of social engagement. We thought all those people suffered. We thought we should help them all. Why did we help all of those people better than they did? And this is engaging with some of the tax burden stuff at the same time. We thought that that was necessarily more likely to happen, that we could alleviate the most suffering when individuals engage with systems rather than just the government and just tax. Why is that true? Because we thought that individuals who would empathise in different ways. So you might have somebody like Bill Gates and Melinda Gates who are particularly passionate about doing things in Africa, and you might have another person who's particularly passionate about helping out women who are victims of domestic violence. We thought that states didn't have the same capacity to differentiate between interests in that way, because we thought that there were like only so many speeches you could make at the end of the day about like different aid policies or different policies to alleviate suffering. I'm going to go on to that a little bit more in the efficacy idea. Thirdly, did you have to give up everything? We thought that no, like I told you why, you could still do things like investing in factories or education because that could meaningfully alleviate suffering down the line. This was a debate about luxury goods. We didn't think that stood. Finally, with regards to like your right to happiness and how that was scaled, they had to engage with the material Sam brought you about why it was that materialism was a hoax. Because what we told you was that even if it is true that your happiness is subjective, we thought it was likely that having 8 iPhones didn't make you particularly happier than having 7 iPhones or even 1 iPhone in this debate. Because what we told you was that came at the cost of the friendships and the human connections that you held in this world. Because you alienated your friends at the point that they were told they had to be jealous of you or that you had to be jealous of them. We thought human connection was always more meaningful than a shiny piece of metal on our side of the house. So why is it in your long run interest in this debate? I'm going to expand on what Sam brought you here. 3 main reasons we think that you might find yourself in a place of suffering down the line. The first is to say that we think suffering is one of the largest causes of crime and violence in our world. Why is that true? Because we like to think on our side of the house that people aren't inherently bad or evil. What we would say is that people who are victims of systemic alienations whereby nobody has ever shown you any empathy, you therefore become less willing or able to show empathy to the people around you. But secondly, we'd say that that's just true insofar as we think a lot of people commit crimes of desperation where they have to commit, like join a gang or steal something in order to feed their family. So we think that when you alleviate their suffering, you meaningfully decrease your chances of being a victim of crime. Second thing to note is that we think that privilege is necessarily fleeting. So we think we take a lot of things for granted in this debate. So that's things like good physical or mental health, or even things like the conditions in the market that allow you to accrue wealth at the rate that you do. Third thing is we think you could just be unlucky, and this is what I flagged in my introduction. We think that things like addiction or sexual assault or domestic violence take no notice of how many zeros exist on the end of your paycheck in this debate. We think that those are things that all humans can be subject to at some point in their life. So what that means is that you doing what you can to alleviate suffering creates a safety net for yourself that the state never can. But we note that these things, however fleeting that harm may be, or however unforeseen that harm may be, cannot be mitigated by any number of yachts. We don't think that an iPhone can save you from the traps of an addiction or being a victim of domestic violence. We think you should privilege looking out for your long run safety that way. Finally, with regards to efficacy, they were you have to donate to good charities. We told you we're pretty happy to stand for that. We thought that was a net benefit on our side of the house. But secondly, what we'd say is that we think the topic implies some sort of direct cash injection to charity. We think that's one of the best forms of charity, whereby we give countries the autonomy, or people the autonomy to lift themselves out of poverty. With regards to tax, we told you the ways in which taxation was more politicised than our system in a way that was bad. Happy to propose.
I'd like to thank the second speaker of the affirmative for her speech and invite James Penn to continue the case for Auckland.
It's a very confused moral principle that underlies this proposition's case. Because at second, it became relatively clear that they wanted to say the reason why we have this vague but absolute obligation to donate to everyone who might possibly be suffering, but also the people who might be suffering who we have a proximate connection to, is that all forms of suffering are subjective. The problem with that is for someone who's grown up in a materialistic society, who's got used to the world of materialism, and for whom spending money on a good like Starbucks or a house with 5 bedrooms or a decent car rather than a bike, for that person, not spending that money on that desirable thing was a form of suffering. They are foregoing a significant amount of welfare that they can otherwise get. But by the logic of this side of the house, because all suffering is subjective, you have a right to do those things. So if they want to stand behind the principled responses they gave you to James' speech, they have to realise that you can be selfish in society and that individual choice does matter. I'll look at 2 questions in this speech. Number 1, is their duty and their moral obligation actually tenable at this point in the debate? And the second is to look at what the actual impact on the welfare of all people in society will be as a result of this suggestion. Firstly, is their duty tenable? I firstly want to point out, again, some confusion in relation to the moral standards that they set up. Because on the one hand, they wanted to say that individual choice over charities is better because happiness is subjective. But then also within the first proposition speech, that no one's happiness is more important than others. So you can never prioritise your own happiness over that of others. The problem is, that also means that you can't prioritise the happiness of one person over the happiness of someone who might be a victim within a women's shelter over the happiness of someone who is dying of famine in Africa. The problem with that is that in order to say things like happiness in this debate are metrics by which you should make decisions, you have to accept that there is some standard. And we would suggest the standard is something like the impact on someone's welfare. That impact is far greater in a situation where you may be dying from famine than a situation where you might be left in the lurch because of a domestic violence situation. As crude as that sounds, the problem with their moral obligation and the absolutist nature of this motion is that it requires people to always look at the areas where they can most improve people's welfare rather than the areas where they might have a proximate connection, which was what this proposition cared about. Because if they said they want people to donate to women's shelters because they might one day fall victim to that violence themselves, that understood that some people care more about, and it was okay for people to care more about things that are proximate to their lives than necessarily the objective welfare of everyone else in society. That was the problem, first of all, with their moral obligation. They told us that in response that both homeless New York people and African famine victims matter in this debate. As I indicated in my introduction, that wasn't a particularly consistent line. That wasn't particularly tenable for the reason that at the point that you accept that, you also accept that individuals can value their own suffering, i.e. from not getting that desirable good, over the suffering of someone else, at the point that you want to stand by this extreme subjective line. We told you they don't actually believe in that principle also when they set up things like you still can spend money on your child's schooling, because someone else in the developing world would benefit much more from that schooling. So at the point that you have this obligation to alleviate other people's suffering rather than things that are desirable for you and your family, it's unclear why you're allowed to continue to do that. Additionally, they never responded to the example we gave you at first opposition, which was, in a situation where you are choosing what house to buy, you could probably fit your entire family within a small one-bedroom house. But most people would accept that it's okay, and we assume this proposition says it's okay for you to buy a 3 or a 4-bedroom house for that family. But unfortunately, that wasn't consistent with their moral framework, which was that you have to alleviate all suffering before you actually do anything which might be desirable or make your own life a little bit more comfortable. So their principle there was rather confused. We told you on our side of the house that choice, direction, and purpose are important things for human life and enrichment. What do I mean by this? The whole reason we work in many situations is so that we can have some control over our destiny. And in order to do that, you need to be able to do the things which give you small bursts of happiness, like seeing a nice shirt in the window of a shop and saying, I want to buy that. That small rush of happiness that you get from that, for you might be a lot more than the benefit of sending $20 or $30 overseas. Importantly also, we suggested that you can't even have choice and direction over destiny in the way that you choose charities under this proposition, because you always have to go to the objectively best charity, the one that saves the most lives, the one that increases welfare objectively the most overseas. And in that respect, we think you undermine people's ability to choose direction in their life, which brings a huge amount of enrichment. What I want to add here also is that often happiness is very subjective and relative as opposed to absolute. So while it is very unfortunate there's a lot of suffering in the developing world, it's not clear that where the point is that utility is maximized by sending money over to that area of the world versus foregoing it here. Why? Because often we've come to expect certain standards of happiness, and to forego those would be a massive imposition on our way of life. By contrast, often if you look at net happiness indexes, individuals over in those countries are actually in many cases more happy than those within the developed world. So in that respect, we think this idea of happiness and maximizing other people's happiness, it's not actually clear that having an absolute principle where you give all money that you might possibly spend on desirables over to those people will actually maximize happiness. We also suggested that this places an uneven burden within rich societies. What do I mean by that? Yes, you might say that there is a collective obligation on the developed world to improve the welfare standards of the developing world, but it's not clear why that obligation has to fall more on some individuals than others. So if you're an individual who's worked particularly hard and perhaps has pulled yourself up by your bootstraps, and we accept that this isn't everyone, the problem with this proposition is it says you have a bigger moral burden than someone who didn't work equally as hard, who just rested on their laurels and didn't actually go out and work at all. And imposing that uneven moral burden there was never a justification for that from this side of the house. Okay, so that deals with why their duty is not particularly clear, why this absolute line that you have to always give every single dollar that you might spend on a desirable good actually stands in this debate. I want to move now on to the actual impact on welfare. Firstly, they told us that materialism equals miserable lives. What we pointed out at first opposition that they have not responded to is it's unclear why abandoning that materialism equals happiness. The reason being, often we have become accustomed to that materialism. And indeed, the reason why they think it's miserable and it just keeps going and it's an endless cycle is that we know that whenever we break that cycle, whenever we don't satisfy those materialistic urges, we become less happy people. So in that respect, we don't think they've sufficiently shown that people in the developed world or with this making this choice will actually become happier. Next we had the question of the trade-off between taxation and consumption versus charity. They told us that the government is always bad and they're shutting down welfare centres. So we support these individuals, perhaps advocating for those welfare centres to be reopened, because if they're as politically powerful as the proposition in this debate, we can say they should do that. This debate is about making a judgment about the choices you should make. So we can say that equally you should maximise your own happiness in the purchasing decisions that you make, but also use your political power to ensure that some balance is received. Additionally, they told us yachts don't help the developing world, but factories do that build those yachts in many cases. Starbucks does, and often that's a preferable mechanism because it empowers those people rather than makes them feel as though they're just the beneficiaries of a Western imposition of welfare. Additionally, I want to say that this often crowds out local industry when you have this type of welfare, rather than allowing things like microfinance loans, which operate from both a self-interested point of view, but also enable these people to have some control over their destiny. Very proud to oppose this extremist stance.
I'd like to thank the second speaker of the negative for his speech and invite Stephen to conclude the substantive case.
Mr. Speaker, while it's easy to accuse us on the affirmative team of being inconsistent, and we're not, and I'll explain that a little bit more in my material, it's really also like the negative team has gotten away with an awful lot of being equally inconsistent. This was a team that said innovation is key, and yet they'd also said, oh, but there's the appropriate tax burden. This is the team that said shirts in the window make you really happy, but also Warren Buffett is the greatest actor in this debate because he donates all of his money away. They're the team in this debate that said our model was bad because it was an absolute obligation, but that there was a huge extent to which subjectively individuals could do a huge amount of good in their communities. Ultimately, it was the negative team in this